Hello, my name is Tara, and I will discuss Michel Foucault. And I'm going to talk about a few of Foucault's concepts. In the previous lecture, I talked about the history of sexuality, and I discussed the ways that Foucault's work is historical in nature. But more than just describing history, Foucault is interested in how different historical epochs led to different ideas about, or competing perhaps, ideas about sex and sexuality. And so I talked about the ways that in the pre-modern, pre-19th century period, Foucault uh, argues that Europe often thought of sex in terms of sex acts. Um, and so the act of, say, what was referred to as sodomy was the sex act, and it was often frowned upon by the church. However, in the modern period, from the 19th century onward, in Europe, the rise of the nation state, which corresponds to the rise of the colonies, gave way to the idea that sex is associated with personhood, that who we have sex with is not just about acts, it is about our personhood, our identity. So while sodomy, which was the term that was used, was a kind of an act, it was not a person. And so this kind of rise of personhood as sex corresponds with the institutionalization of sex and people who have sex in ways that could be deemed to be abnormal. And so Michel Foucault was interested in the ways that institutions could punish and discipline queer people. And as a gay male theorist, what concerns Michel Foucault is obviously the use of the institution in Europe from the modern period onward to punish queer people using, say, electrocution or conversion therapy in the healthcare system, imprisonment, deportation, all of these modes of social control and violence. And so we discussed the difference then between sex acts and personhood. There are obviously um, positive aspects of this relationship or this turn from sex as acts and sex as actions into sex as personhood. And this is about rights. So that if I was once someone who had sex and it would have been thought of only as my action, I could be someone who declares myself to be, say, queer or to be uh, transgender or to be divorced or to be uh, a survivor of sexual violence or to be asexual. And while these would have once been associated with acts, sex acts, they can now form the basis of my personhood in ways that allow me to claim legal rights, and in ways that allow me to mobilize my identity as a form of politics, but also as a set of rights that allow me to work, that allow me to claim income, that allow me to claim respect, integrity, and that also allow me to mobilize my rights against those who would threaten them using the law and demanding, say, financial compensation for injury. So, in this half of the lecture, I will discuss other concepts from the work of Michel Foucault. I will discuss sécurité versus discipline. Then I will talk about Foucault's idea, a regime of truth, discipline and knowledge. Then I will discuss panopticon. We've talked about biopolitics briefly, or I discussed biopolitics briefly in the previous lecture. And so I will return to biopolitics, and then finally I will finish by discussing homo soccer, which is a concept from Giorgio Agamben, which I also mentioned in the first lecture, drawing on Shireen Razak's writings about the murder of Cindy Gladue, in which Shireen Razak uses the term homo soccer to discuss missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So first, where is discipline cabined, concentrated, and enclosed its space of operations? Sécurité was centrifugal. The apparatuses of security have the constant tendency to expand. They are centrifugal. Security therefore involves organizing or anyway allowing the development of ever wide circuits. So, what is interesting for Foucault is that discipline just says no. So, as a modus operandi or as a philosophy, discipline as an idea says no. It encloses its space of operation. It disallows entry. So when we discipline others, we just say no, you are not allowed entry. So if you imagine people trying to enter a building, disciplinary power would say no, you are not allowed to enter this space. Security, however, involves things like security cameras, surveillance. So you can enter the space, but you will be under securitization. So, my postdoctoral research was in London, England, which is a great city to visit. Um, but because of security or sécurité, which also exists in Paris next to London, London is a city where you can walk around, you can go out at night, you can buy whatever you want, you can definitely wear what you want, you can say what you want, but you are under securitization. So you are actually under surveillance constantly. So the City of London would not necessarily say, no, you can't come to London. No, you are not allowed entry. No, you are not British. You can't enter London. People can enter London. It's quite an easy city to be a tourist in, to get a visa. You have to spend a lot of money, and you are under constant surveillance. So discipline would have also been about a time, and the powers of discipline, when thought about in relation to politics and borders and state power, what disciplinary power would have and still does allow for is for someone to say, this is my country, you cannot enter. And this is our country, and it is, say, a Christian country or a Hindu country or a Catholic country, and you cannot enter. And so then you would know that you cannot enter this country. Securitization allows people to enter, but you have to have permits, study permits, work permits. You have to constantly be under self-surveillance. So you have to check your own permits. And if your permits run out at a certain date, it's up to you to renew those permits. You have to make money on your own. You have to sort things out on your own. If you enter a country and you unfortunately are not successful and you don't do well, securitization does not really protect you. It just allows you these freedoms with this constant sense of surveillance. So the banking set the sorry, the system of banking is a good example. In the past, and still to this day in many places, it's difficult to get financial credit and credit cards. One would have to live on their wage, and it could be the wage of a subsistence farmer who is only going to sell the foods they grow, and then the life of a subsistence farmer who lives on the small amounts of money and the food they grow. In the time of security or sécurité for Foucault, we are given all this credit, but it is up to you to manage your spending. And so this illusion of freedom involves this ongoing sense of organizing and allows for the development of circuits of control. So where discipline focused on even the smallest infractions. Securite, let the small things go. The apparatus of security lets things happen, allowing prices to rise, allowing scarcity to develop, and letting people go hungry. So, if there is scarcity, if there is massive credit card debt, security just keeps working. More people can enter, they can get more cards, they can find more jobs, they can find more ways of paying. So, there isn't really this sense of a power of disciplinary authority that ever really says no. The benefit is that things will keep working. You can enter a country, you can enter a building, you can buy, but things will keep happening. Housing prices will rise, homelessness will rise, scarcity will develop, people will go hungry, and there will be no stopping of neoliberal capitalism. Third, whereas discipline sought to eliminate and eradicate completely, sécurité, in contrast, tries only to minimize, to seek to an optimal level of targeted behavior to achieve a certain equilibrium, not to eliminate, but to regulate to the most advantageous level. So Foucault is interested in certain institutions like the mental health system of services, or what he refers to in that time period as the insane asylum and the prison. When people discipline, they remove people from the streets, they quarantine people, they keep people uh, under total control. Securite is different. It just tries to minimize the levels of, say, harm that someone who is unwell would do to others. It tries to minimize the kind of harm that someone could do for themselves. It tries to achieve this equilibrium. But this kind of, say, problems are not really totally eliminated. In sum, for Foucault, sécurité differed significantly from discipline in its mode of functioning. As Michel Foucault explained, an apparatus of security cannot operate well except on condition that it is given freedom, in the modern sense that it acquires in the 18th century, no longer the exemptions and privileges attached to a person, but the possibility of movement, change of place, and processes of circulation of both people and things. So security can only operate within the context of freedom. One has to have the freedom to open a bank account, to then have credit cards, to then go into debt, to then be under surveillance, to pay this debt. And so there are no longer exemptions and privileges attached to a person, but the possibility of movement. And so this is why people can kind of move freely, or with the illusion of freedom, only because of securitization. What is important is to think about the consequences of these different modes of philosophy, but also state governance. So while discipline would have said no, and we can think that no, you can't come into our country, is obviously draconian, xenophobic, wrong. Yes, you can come into our country, but we will not take responsibility for you if you do not have enough money to stay here and you could end up dying on the streets, is securitization. And so the apparent freedom will always come with this sense of securitization. And the costs, I think, have to be thought of seriously. And Foucault was interested in the state and the ways that institutions work to govern. And so it is not just that the state, meaning the system of government, who we elect, is in a position of authority. We are governed by institutions like the banking sector, like the system of housing, like hospitals. Uh, we must enter into these systems of routine in order to be kind of subject, or in order to participate in society. There are obviously exceptions to this, but societies, for Foucault, in the modern period on and from the modern period onwards, are really societies of securitization, and freedom is always met with this stark reality of security and securitization. So, the second concept I would like to discuss is regime of truth. And a regime of truth for Michel Foucault is not the truth itself. It is the way that we speak about certain events, certain people, certain truths that make a regime of words or ideas feel like sincerity. So Foucault's writing draws on the term varedictions. And varedictions, and this term varedictions, which is a European term, and the history of the varediction allows Michel Foucault to then come to this other concept, discourse, and then finally to regime of truth. Writing about himself under the name Maurice Florence, Foucault described the organizing question of his work as an inquiry into the productive relationship between subjects and objects, of discovering, quote, the processes of subjectivization and objectivization that allow for the subject to become, as subject, an object of knowledge. Understanding these interdependent processes is ultimately a question of varedictions and truth games that can establish the rules according to which the respect of certain things, according to which uh, with respect to certain things, what a subject may stems from questions of truth and falsehood. So the processes of subjectivization and objectivization allow for the subject to become a subject, an object of knowledge. So we become ourselves as objects of knowledge. We become ourselves through certain categorizations of who we are in objective knowledge or supposedly objective forms of knowledge production, like in science. So when someone is born, they're categorized scientifically as a certain type of person. And the healthcare system might categorize your blood as being a type of blood. The healthcare system could categorize you as being in a certain age range, being a certain weight. And so we become subjects through objectivization of knowledge. And this objectivization of knowledge involves a certain form of biopolitics. The state counts your birth, they count your parents' identity on your birth certificate. So for Foucault, understanding these interdependent processes is ultimately a question of varedictions and truth games that can establish the rules according to which, with respect to certain things, what a subject may say stems from the questions of truth and falsehood. So who we are and who we become is really about these truth games, varedictions. And varedictions are really about the forms in which a certain discourse is capable of being deemed to be true and false and articulated with a domain of things. So again, Foucault's work is really always interested in these moments, in the time before the pre-modern period, in the time of religion. Varedictions would have been truth claims and truth games of religious people. The apostles would have made these varedictions. For the state, there are new discourses of science, of law, of medicine that are produced. The history of varedictions for Foucault is understood as the forms according to which discourses are capable of being deemed true or false and are articulated with a domain of things. What the conditions of that emergence have been, what price has been paid for it, as it were, what effects it has had on the real, and the way in which linking a certain type of object with certain modalities of the subject, it has constituted for a time, a space, and particular individuals the historical a priori of a possible experience. So becoming a subject who is subjected to objective knowledge about, say, what it means to have a disability has real consequences in life. And there are certain times and places in history where having a disability meant that one was thought to be evil, or incapable of having children, or religiously flawed. And many religious discourses have often thought, constructed people with disabilities as being imperfect because of God's anger towards them. And so, if you are a person with a disability, you might be deemed to be bad in some way, imperfect in some way. The history of medicine has often wanted to kill people with disabilities and has wanted to subject them to ongoing forms of invasive medicine, including heavy uses of drugs and pharmaceuticals. People with disabilities have been used as guinea pigs. People with disabilities have been often referred to as those who should die. This has obviously changed, and the knowledge that is produced about people with disabilities changed a great deal after the Holocaust and because of political campaigns against fascism. So Foucault is really passionate about valedictions and about what discourses are capable of being deemed true or false and how they are articulated by the police and, yes, by the healthcare system and by the state. Um, and so the Holocaust in my research forms the basis of my critique of norms and my critique of health and healthcare and my critique of discrimination as always forming and always determining what is deemed true and false by any state. Um, and my arguments often rely on my understanding that minorities and the way that minorities look or speak, or the access that money or the access that minorities have to a certain amount of capital, will always be understood through a set of truth claims and a set of discourses that often already understand that one's access to truth is already determined by their access to privilege. So when one says that Cindy Gladue was, quote, a native girl, unquote, a native prostitute in an Ontario court of law after Bradley Barton stuck a knife into her vagina and she bled to death in an Edmonton motel room, we can return to Foucault, the history, a history of valedictions, understood as the forms according to which discourses capable of being deemed true or false are articulated with the domain of things. What the conditions of that emergence have been, what price has been paid for it, as it were, what effects it has had on the real, and the way in which linking a certain type of object with certain modalities of the subject, it has constituted for a time, a space, and particular individuals the history a priori of a possible experience. So the history of this experience of defaming Cindy Gladue, of mocking her after her death, is the history of settler colonialism as it happens in real time on Turtle Island, a white settler country with thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, a white settler country with many people who have killed missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls because of their racism, because of their sexism, because of their willful neglect, and because of their active hatred of others. In other words, The question of how a subject becomes an object of knowledge is not a question about the truth or falsity of a particular subject or subject as object, but rather about how there comes to be a way of talking about truth or falsehood at all. And what interests Foucault is how the church, in the time of theocracy in Europe, spoke about truth only in relation to biblical texts. The state obviously has a whole set of discourses that emerge in which to talk about truth and falsehood. The project, which he insisted connected the breadth of his work, was to illuminate these rules, these truth games, and these practices of establishing the truth. It was centered on discourse and the savior and the savoirs under which practices and techniques can be meaningfully referred to in a language of truth and falsehood. Foucault's research on the history of prisons did not come out of criminological interests after all, but rather from a sense that prisons were important laboratories for many of the new techniques of governance used in modern industrial societies after the mid-19th century. In other work, he documented and analyzed other laboratories, physicians' consulting rooms, census bureaus, the texts of economists, the autobiographical musings of Greco-Roman gentlemen, and the ambitions of early public health reformers, to name a few. Each research project gave rise to new ideas that are not general concepts, but whose utility is by no means limited to the context giving rise to them. So prisons for Foucault were laboratories, and there were laboratories in which new techniques of governance were used against those who were made into lab rats by the prison industrial complex. We can consider Foucault's writings now after the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and after many scathing critiques of the prison industrial complex and incarceration in general. So the third point I will discuss is discipline and knowledge. Both discipline and punish uh, and this text, Punishment and Welfare, were replete with information about the practices of governance that historically constituted the modern soul and simultaneously built knowledge-based institutions. Discipline. Michel Foucault's account of discipline, therefore, resonated. Sorry, my camera phones resonated. Oh my gosh, my face is so large in this. Okay. Okay. Discipline, therefore, resonated with the methodological and political preferences. Foucault's account of discipline, I'll start again, therefore resonated with the methodological and political preferences that already existed among critical criminologists, beginning to find Marxism either tired or insufficient, but wishing to maintain a left-wing stance. Discipline was clearly linked by Foucault to the rise of the industrial proletariat and bourgeois society's need for working bodies with standardized capacities. But the discipline and punished story carefully avoided making capital the motor force of history. So Michel Foucault is really critical of all of these institutions, the prison that uses people as lab rats to try to use incarceration to normalize someone who, say, has radical political beliefs or refuses to work a 9 to 5 job and refuses to be, say, someone who plays their role in the class structure as the servant of others. The healthcare system for Foucault is also suspicious because of its obsession with the heterosexual family and the electrocution or persecution of those who are not heterosexual or those who do not perform under these signs of, say, white Catholic masculinity and femininity. And Foucault is really interested then in how these institutions actually govern people by teaching us to kind of repeat these norms over and over again. The ultimate goal is also to produce docile bodies for the workforce. So, children who will be born into certain families who will only work in certain occupations because of their class position, women whose sole role will be to give birth to a certain race and religion of children that will live in certain neighborhoods or districts and only play a certain role. So Foucault is interested then in how one can resist these norms and this disciplinary power. An additional factor that explains why Foucault's work itself became the victim of the success of, quote, discipline concerns Foucault's analysis of the relationship between knowledges and powers, which in Discipline and Punish was not as clearly distinguished from the critique of ideology approach as would be the case in later work on governmentality and security and on sexuality and ethics. Th- that supposedly neutral knowledges, such as psychology or social work, wield a great deal of power, even when used benevolently, was already an accepted point of view in the 1970s, in the left at any rate. And it must be recalled that the left was then relatively much larger than it is today. Michel Foucault's analysis of the role of expert knowledges in the formation and implementation of disciplinary apparatuses was thus not completely novel. So Michel Foucault then was interested in the ways that knowledge is always instrumental to wielding power over and against and in favor of and not in favor of others. And so producing knowledge about a population of people could be a way of killing a population of people. Producing knowledge about a group of people could be a way of promoting a group of people. Many readers of Discipline and Punish miss the fact that Foucault took the critical view of knowledge and power one crucial step further. Instead of focusing on the ways in which knowledge systems could function as delivery systems for ideology, Foucault argued more radically that knowledges are themselves forms of power. So knowledge and power for Foucault are not distinct. There is not just the knowledge we produce about a group of people and then the power we have over them. We produce knowledge as a way of enacting power relations. So if we speak about Palestinians as freedom fighters, that is very different than producing knowledge of Palestinians as, say, terrorists. Our words and our language and our categorization is about how we govern people and how we distribute power, not only in society, but globally. So if we speak about transgender people and transgender rights, that is very different than speaking about people who have quote unquote gender dysphoria or gender identity crises, and then we can then use power against them to try to convince them that they are something other than transgender. And these categories of persons, this knowledge is not, it is indistinguishable from the power we then have and the power we create against and over and with and for others. So the fourth point is the panopticon. The panopticon for Foucault is how we construct systems of surveillance where we can watch others and where the state can watch others and where agents of the state can watch others. So this is a clip about the panopticon and the concept from today. And this is again the blog Theory and Philosophy, in which David discusses philosophical concepts like panopticon.
We're talking about the panopticon, which is a word chances are we all know. Foucault, panopticon, post-structuralism, who cares, whatever. I don't want this to be like super basic, so I want to try and explain it in a great amount of detail so that you get something new from this, I hope. So there's a lot to cover. Before getting into it, You can find this in podcast form anywhere where you get podcasts. Leave a comment on there because I think I know how to check it. But at the very least, leave a bunch of stars because that'd be great. If you're listening to this in podcast form, you can find me on YouTube where I do videos. If you want to see my mugshot, then if you want, don't feel obliged. You can support me by simply subscribing, liking, sharing, telling your family. Who knows, your great aunt might get a real kick out of this. Then again, she might not. You can also contribute monetarily with Patreon or PayPal. Links for all that will be in the description, which would be a great help. But take care of yourself first, or contribute to an organization that could really use that support much more than me. So the Panopticon. Let me give you the rundown of what Foucault does in his book titled Discipline and Punish. So he lays out that for a very long time, we were under what he calls sovereign rule, where there was sovereign power. And that was the situation in which there was like a king or monarch or something that demonstrated their military and their disciplinary might by inflicting harm on people. So if you stepped out of line, it was the responsibility of the sovereign to punish you, not directly, they had people to do it for them, but to punish you so that you could not only suffer, because your body at that time was seen as a site of suffering, you could be made an example of so that other people won't commit the crime that you commit because they know how shitty the outcome is. So he calls this the spectacle of the scaffold, in which people in like the town square were tortured brutally for everyone to see. Now, this raised a few problems for power. And Foucault says that, well, if you demonstrate your power in such an overt way, that is, for everyone to see, you leave yourself open to some kind of attack, or at the very least, you become the very point in which all power emanates from. And it becomes very easy then for power to be usurped, which didn't necessarily happen all the time. So, some of the other ways that people were directly affected would be they would be thrown into dungeons, and if they weren't tortured, they were essentially hidden away from sight so that they wouldn't be a part of society. And above, maybe not above that, but additionally, people would be cast out of society, especially if they were mad or anything like that, so that they wouldn't be a burden on society. But at some point, something changed. And we see a transition from what Foucault described as sovereign power to disciplinary power. And disciplinary power operates differently. It doesn't seek to just inflict harm on the body, or it doesn't seek to just make an example out of people by showing how much they can suffer so that other people will be deterred from committing a crime. It also claims to change people. It also claims to make people proper for society. So instead of it being a matter of inflicting harm on someone who was only to be ultimately judged by God, suddenly society saw itself as being the arbiter of what was good and right, and it could inflict harm against people in order to make them better for society. So it wouldn't always be physical torture. It would be rehabilitation. It would be counseling. It would be anything like that. I think it's important to say that if your takeaway from this is to despise all sites of power, be it like psychiatry or counseling, anything like that, then while you might be right, according to Foucault, we shouldn't do away with all of these potentially beneficial institutions, especially for people who really need it. So keep that on the back burner. So this marked a shift, right? As I've already kind of said. But previously, if someone committed a crime, the sovereign, that is the king, queen, monarch, whatever, felt as though they were the one that was attacked, right? They were the one that took the burden of the crime. With disciplinary power, suddenly other people get involved, and an attack against society is then felt as an attack on the social body. So it's an attack on everyone. And so with this, we see a kind of percolation of a resentment of criminals. Whereas previously, and Foucault documents this, there was almost a fascination with criminals, almost like in the moments where someone was being tortured, they were closer to God because they were closer to death, and that therefore they possessed some kind of innate or superior knowledge of the world. Not to mention the fact that they had the courage to challenge the king or monarch, queen, or anything. This inflictment of new pain against the social body demanded a new form of, I guess, organization as far as power went. And here we enter the panopticon. So the panopticon was a structure proposed by Jeremy Bentham, a utilitarian philosopher who wanted to make prison structures more instrumental, to make them more economic, more effective. So I'm sure we all know, but panoptic means sight, optic, pan all around, so all around sight. And this is what the structure looks like. It is a circular structure with a guard tower in the middle. And the guard tower is a 360-degree view of the circular ring structure. And the circular ring structure is comprised of prison cells that can all be viewed from the watchtower. Now, it is unclear from the vantage point of the prisoner if there is a guard in the guard tower. So, what happens, and Foucault is very quick to pick up on this, it doesn't actually matter if there's a guard in there because the people don't know if they're being watched. So he says something interesting happens here, and that is that the people start to watch themselves. And that happens out of the fear of them being watched. So one example that I take from a prof that I had many years ago, Dr. Brophy, and I think it's an apt example. He said, well, if you're driving, let's say you're in the prairies, if you're in Canada, or in the desert in, Nevada somewhere, you're driving and you come across a stop sign and you can see for miles and miles and miles, and you know for a fact that there is not a cop in sight. Many of us still stop. I'm not saying everyone does. And it would be wrong to think that Foucault is saying everyone suddenly follows the rules and everyone is suddenly a cog in this machine. But some of us stop. And that is a very interesting phenomenon. And it demonstrates this panoptic structure at play, where we, instead of us being watched, we are governing ourselves. So Foucault, looking at this then, says it opens up a whole bunch of interesting implications. It means for him, and these are his words, that visibility is a trap. So while we might think that it might be better to be out in the open, it might be better for us to be seen because that's how we express ourselves. That's how I communicate with everyone on YouTube or in podcast form or whatever. Well, it might appear like this is a demonstration of one's own identity, one's own freedom. Foucault warns that these types of visibility or these openings up or forays into visibility might actually be sites of control. Now, how does that make sense? Well, I like to imagine it like a kid in a sandbox. So the sandbox to the kid might appear to have infinite potential, right? Sky's the limit. Your imagination is the only thing slowing you down. But to an outside observer, we know that the sandbox is kind of demarcated. It's bordered by these like four walls that structure it in a very clear way. But within the structure, there's a great deal of opportunity allowed. The kid, however, doesn't think about the walls. The kid's only focused on the sand and all the possibilities afforded by it. And it's in that moment, or in this kind of our feelings of kind of pure freedom, this kind of pure potential, that we might actually be the most controlled. So Foucault says that the panoptic structure allows people to be seen instantly, and then being seen then opens them up to specific kinds of surveillance so that they can be controlled, they can be organized, they can be clumped into masses. And this sets the timber for biopolitics, a term I'll do another day, where people are organized according to populations. And it really benefits from this panoptic structure, this panoptic form of power, which is what he says is the ideal form of power, because there isn't a point that we could say that it is from there that power is emanating. It is from there I'm being controlled. No, It is us that has come to internalize the I of power, and we then control ourselves. So another thing that Foucault makes very apparent, and not really apparent, he just says it flat out, power is productive. It makes people act. So, like the kid in the sandbox, as soon as he enters the sandbox, he enters into a very clearly marked off, controlled zone. But that zone, the sandbox, makes the kid operate in a certain way. That is, the kid wants to play with the sand and make certain structures and dig holes and eat sand. I don't know, whatever kids do in the sand. The kid wants to do these things. And this is a product of this kind of established zones, kind of established system that is limited only by the kid themselves in their minds, but is actually very well managed and coded. So there are no more bars, there are no more like prison guards per se, none of that. There's just the pure functioning of power that has been completely internalized. Now, it's I've covered this whole book in a lot more detail in on my channel and podcast form, so go check that out if you want a fuller account. But it seems a little bit reductive to say that we've just like kind of fallen into this new disciplinary power system and that's all there is to it. He does complicate it a bit, but it is a little bit reductive, and I'd like to hear what other people have to say. But just throwing that out there. The panopticon, then, because of its kind of visible character, is then going to be open to kind of democratic alternatives and changes and movements. And the reason for that is that, there's no single point of power, as I made clear. Instead, Foucault says that the panopticon operates democratically, and that's what makes it so pernicious. It makes it appear as though, encouraging you to participate in some while foreclosing others to you. And this is used in all walks of life. Take the hospital, for instance, where humans are reduced to observable symptomatic entities that can then be put under a certain kind of microscopic lens so that they could be better understood, so they could be mapped and coded and controlled. Or schools or offices that are designed in such a way as to make people always visible. Because if you're always visible, then you not only fear the, thought of other people seeing you, you start to wonder, how do I appear to myself? Do I like who I am? Which is a moment in, I guess, disciplinary power that is only possible when we have moved away from locating power at a certain site, that is the king or whatever, to ourselves. So we see that the panopticon is an individuating machine. It makes of people individuals that, are isolated in their bodies. And this is, certainly in keeping with the atomistic principle of capitalism and its emergence. But we could become so absorbed with ourselves that, it hinders the possibility of collective engagement in certain ways, which is, one of the implications that Foucault doesn't really address, but is certainly there. So with the functioning of the panopticon and its extension into all walks of life, we see the entrance of a new form of kind of control, one that moves beyond disciplinary control into pure carceral control, which is the term he attributes to this moment in which all people govern themselves perfectly according to a perfect movement of power. And that's more or less it. I hope this is short and sweet. Leave comments and likes and tell me if I did something wrong. I'd love to hear from you. Or if you have any recommendations for what to do next, I'd happily take them. But on that note, take care.
So, if discipline was the Foucauldian term with the greatest influence and success in criminology, the silver medal undoubtedly belonged to the related term panopticon. Like Foucault's critique of disciplinary knowledges, then, Foucault's interest in Bentham's panopticon could be read in two different ways. The more radical and less common reading is interested in the panopticon as a novel technique, but does not demonize it, since, from a Nietzschean perspective, there is no innocent knowledge. Thus, this reading would not hold out any hope that abolishing panopticons in prisons and surveillance would in itself create freedom. However, the panopticon allegory is more commonly interpreted from a quasi-Marxist perspective, in which knowledges are seen as corrupt, if and insofar they are imbricated in oppressive institutions. So Foucault's work is interesting to think about in this time period when we think about prisons and the prison industrial complex, and a lot of the debates regarding incarceration, carceral power, and prisons that are being had in media and at the level of politics. Um, there is no innocent knowledge for Foucault. Thus, this reading would not hold out any hope that abolishing panopticons and prisons and surveillance would in itself create freedom. However, the panopticon allegory is more commonly interpreted from a quasi-Marxist perspective, in which knowledges are seen as corrupt if and insofar as they are imbricated in oppressive institutions. So this takes us back to norms and normativity and the building of a nation state through biopolitical categories of nation building and governance that favor a purportedly or a covert eugenic program in which certain citizens are seen to be valued. And in this kind of use of biopolitics as a form of nation building, there is always necropolitics. And necropolitics for Achille Mbembe, a South African theorist, corresponds with colonialism. So if we think about the panopticon and modes of governance, we can think about the colonial gaze, which often constructed people in the colonies as being those who could die, and those who could die without the privileges of European citizenship, those who could die after being robbed and after being enslaved. Foucault's discipline and punish account does not preclude either reading. Since nothing is said about whether prisons themselves and prison abolitionists also engage in practices of knowledge that are simultaneously practices of power, that crucial ambiguity probably contributed a great deal to the success of the panopticon image. A second crucial ambiguity is that while in Discipline and Punish, Bentham's panopticon is rendered as a chapter in the history of disciplinary governance, elsewhere Foucault pointed out that the panopticon is from another perspective, quote, the oldest dream of the most ancient sovereign. This embodies the inherently sovereign desire to not ever lose sight of any subjects. So if we think about Foucault in relation to Marx, for Marx, the ruling ideology of every epoch is the ideology of the ruling class. The knowledge that is produced about prisons, and even the knowledge that could be produced about prison abolition, is still imbued with this power, this will to know a certain population. So the question from Foucault and the questions that emerge perhaps are about the politics of identity. When we produce knowledge about certain populations of, say, people who are referred to as quote unquote black, or people who are referred to as quote unquote mentally unwell, when we produce knowledge about, say, the indigenous, is this knowledge actually imbricated in the workings of institutions that will then discipline and govern these supposed populations of people? Indigenous is not Cree, it is not Ojibwe, it is not a language. So do we do a disservice to people when we kind of create these categories? And why are these categories created? Why do we refuse specificity in terms of language, in terms of nation? Um, Even the idea of governance itself is interesting when you think about the rates of incarceration of the quote unquote indigenous people who have been referred to as Aboriginal, as Native. Cree is a language and Cree is a nation. So we can return to the first lecture about the murder of Cindy Gladue. In a court of law, Cindy Gladue was referred to over 50 times as, quote, a native girl, or, quote, a native prostitute. She was referred to using these kind of categorizations, this knowledge produced about her, after bleeding to death in an Edmonton motel room. Bradley Barton was finally convicted of knifing Cindy Gladue and killing her um, in an Edmonton motel room where she bled to death. So, this kind of knowledge that is produced is obviously knowledge against a group of people, knowledge against women, knowledge against indigenous women. But the knowledge is also against, say, the Cree people and the Cree nation. So the refusal to use the terms Cree or Cree person, the refusal to speak in Cree, to learn any Cree, is also about knowledge production. And the oldest dream of the most ancient sovereign for Foucault is the panopticon, since it embodies the inherently sovereign desire to not ever lose sight of any subject. So, this disciplinary gaze, surveillance, the panopticon, um, which Foucault refers to as this system of surveillance. And Foucault describes in Discipline and Punish the panopticon as a prison where a security guard can walk around and look down at all the prisoners. And so this kind of production of knowledge of Cindy Gladue as, quote, a native girl, or, quote, a native prostitute, is about a system of surveillance where Indigenous people, and specifically Indigenous women, are, quote, girls, meaning that the paternal gaze of the state can watch them. And if they are involved in sex work, then the state has the right to intervene into their bodies, their lives, their bank accounts until they are dead, and then they can be referred to in a court of law as, quote, native girls and, quote, native prostitutes. This way of governing is also a way of killing, and killing undesirable subjects who do not form the biopolitical vitality of a future citizenry of privileged settlers. So the fifth term, as I've discussed already, is biopolitics. So I'll quickly discuss biopolitics, and then I will discuss the final term, which is homo sacer, which we talked about in the first lecture as well. First, let us consider biopolitics, a term designed to capture the collective governance of humans that Foucault argues only became possible with the emergence of population and, quote, populations. Biopolitical strategies from birth control programs to social security to genocide often exist alongside disciplinary programs designed to normalize individuals and generate uniform, disciplined bodies of citizens. But they work at a different level as well, since their target is neither the individual nor the political collectivity, but rather the more or less biologized entity that is the, quote, population. And Foucault is really interested in this idea of the population. How is a population counted? But how are different groups of people counted? So a census, for example, in England, I lived in this place. I've lived in England for many years, and the census asks people, it comes to someone's home, and so it asks people to check a category. So if you live with someone who would be in this category, white, ethnic, and male, they have to check that on the census form. But then my form would be, say, mine is quite different because it's Asian, and in the category of Asian, there's British Asian, British Muslim, Indian, Hindu, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. Like it's a kind of huge category. And then, say, female. And these categories are about population. So this is the British population. So the British population obviously is not uniform, but the British population also is not without categorization and the counting of the population. And so the population is managed in its entirety through these forms of categorization. And for Foucault, the sovereign power really the dream of the sovereign power is to have this kind of mode of surveillance over the population so that it can count. And obviously, the sovereign power is not against us all. The sovereign power can count. And what the sovereign power could say, or what the state could say, is that if there are no British Asian women or women of, say, Asian descent, meaning women who are of South Asian or um, yeah, South Asian descent, who are of, say, Muslim or Sikh or Hindu ancestry. If none of these women have a job in all of England, this would obviously be a problem. If, say, a large percentage of white ethnic British men die of a heart attack before the age of 50, this would be a problem. So, biopolitics then is about how a population becomes a population. And biopolitical strategies like birth control and social security exist alongside, unfortunately, genocide to try to create an ideal population and to try to govern the health of the population. War waged by a sovereign against a political enemy may well inflict large-scale death, but it is qualitatively different, Foucault argues, from the kind of 20th century warfare waged on behalf of and in the name of a race or a people. So war is obviously the most extreme form of biopolitics. So birth control and social security are obviously things that people support and allow a reasonable way of governing a population. But genocide and war are also waged on behalf of and in the name of a race or people. And this is true in contexts in which nation states are trying to actively get rid of an ethnic minority. Biopolitics has, in recent years, become another successful cookie cutter, with proliferating examples of biopolitics being uncovered within the sociology of health and medicine, postcolonial studies, and in theory circles generally. Here, however, we will limit our discussion to biopolitics' relationship to discipline and the reasons for the relative dearth of biopolitical citations in the criminological literature. So, biopolitics is closely related to biopower. Very briefly, biopouvoir is said to be the name Foucault plans to use to cover a series of strategies for bringing biological phenomenon, or rather human activity thought of biologically, within the scope of political power. Although, in fact, later lectures did not explore biopolitics in any detail. Perhaps because it remained largely undeveloped, biopolitics then became the title of the next year's set of lectures, Naissance de la biopolitique, given in January to March of 1979. But these lectures, too, turned out to barely mention biopolitics, being almost wholly devoted to lengthy analysis of German war, post-war liberalism, and Anglo-American neoliberal economies. In terms of work published during Foucault's lifetime, the main discussion of biopolitics occurred in the final chapters of the first volume of the History of Sexuality in 1980, which appeared firstly in French in 1976. There was the point There the point is made that old-fashioned sovereignty wages war against those who are political rivals and competitors for territory, whereas modern governments wage war, sometimes against internal minorities, more vigorously than against foreigners, in the name of the health of the nation, using the metaphor of cleansing the population rather than speaking the traditional sovereign language of loyalty, treason, and enmity. So Foucault finds this modern system of governance suspect, and Foucault is also really critical of slavery and colonialism. So the sovereign power is the sovereign power of Europe. The sovereign power of Europe would have had to wage war against the colonies. The sovereign power of Europe obviously entered in to the colonies to enslave others and to impoverish them. So now we have internal enemies, stories of unarmed Black citizens whose ancestry is connected to slavery, who are often shot by police. And this is the way that old-fashioned sovereignty turns into modern governments who wage war against internal minorities, more vigorously than those who would have been deemed foreigners in other countries. Finally, I'll finish by discussing this concept, Homo sacer. And we discussed Homo sacer in the first lecture, and I cited the work of Homo sacer in Shireen Razak's work. And Shireen Razak it makes the argument or offers this set of discussions regarding whether Indigenous peoples in Canada, like the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls who are written about in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, could be thought of as Homo sacers. Nevertheless, biopolitics too can become a victim of its own success, as it as is happening in circles influenced by Gambon's ahistorical approach to questions of sovereignty and the right of death. In addition to properly deploy biopolitics to analyze some of today's ethnic identifications, one would have to think hard about the ways in which cultural essences have in many instances replaced biological knowledges. In general, the post-World War II shift away from biological dividing lines and toward cultural explanations of differences among groups. Example, the rise of culture poverty arguments, and more recently, cultural difference discourse, suggests that biopolitics, while remaining useful, may need adjusting and revising. So this knowledge production regarding, say, cultural differences or a culture of poverty for Foucault is a way of governing by producing knowledge about populations that are deemed to be different than others because of their cultural backgrounds or their religious difference. Biological knowledges are no longer the main resource for drawing essentialized distinctions among human groups. So I'll return to this point that I made, citing Stuart Hall. I gave this point about Palestine and Palestinians, and it's actually a point that I took from Stuart Hall. Um, based on, so, sorry, Stuart Hall discussed Palestinian struggles through discourse analysis. And Hall analyzed how language and power affect the naming of groups, specifically discussing how Palestinians fighting for land can be labeled as, quote, freedom fighters or, quote, terrorist, depending on the discourse and power structures at play. Hall argued that the labels used to describe political actors are part of a system of power relations, and that these descriptions can become true if people act on them. Stuart Hall is often described as an intellectual freedom fighter due to his work challenging power structures. And Michel Foucault is also described often as one of the most influential philosophers of our time, particularly in regards to queer theory and the ways that his writings regarding sexuality and his writings against the incarceration and the institutionalization of queer people form the basis of queer theory and feminist theory. I will finish with this quote by Michel Foucault. People know what they do. Frequently, they know why they do what they do, but but what they don't know is what they do does. People know what they do. Frequently, they know why they do what they do, but what they don't know is what they do does. So for Foucault, knowledge and the production of discourses which create regimes of truth are inextricable from real power relations of imprisonment, of incarceration, of institutionalization, and of the production of a set of norms which we ourselves participate in and uphold, but can also resist and challenge at all times. And as I said, Michel Foucault wrote passionately about sexuality and his work forms the basis of queer theory and has inspired the LGBTQ2S plus community. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you're doing well. Thank you. Bye bye.